Able Contemporary Gallery presents a very abbreviated history of lithography and its applications, 1798 through 2025 by Roal Carlsen. This video is produced for Able Contemporary Gallery's exhibition, How'd They Do That? July 2025. It's possible that the angel of inspiration came down upon this slightly underdressed printmaker and inspired her in the techniques of lithography. Or maybe Warrington Colescott had the right idea when Senefelder received a tablet of knowledge like Moses on the top of the mount from a Valkyrie in a wheelchair, seen in his Senefelder Receives the Secrets of Lithography series from the history of printmaking. In reality, Czech actor and playwright Alois Senefelder invented lithography in 1796 or 8, depending on where you read it. He was looking for a less expensive and more expedient way to produce sheet music. The story goes that he wrote with a laundry marker on some limestone and found accidentally that putting a piece of paper on top, the impression of his writing was removed. So through the course of experimentation and science, he created the idea of lithography as being a new printmaking form. The quarry at Solnhofen, Germany is still operating today, though lithos stones are not used for commercial printmaking in the contemporary world. Here you can see some stones that have been cut, slabs that are yet to be created in lithostones, into lithostones, and then a stock of older lithostones still available for artists to purchase in a Netherlands warehouse. We need to know exactly how the whole process began. So how litho begins is, first you have to have a stone if you're going to work with stone lithography, and you have to make sure the stone is flat and it is even and level on all sides. There's a graining sink here that the work is done on, and a couple of other stones. There's an image on one stone that has to be removed to make a new print, and that's done with the use of grits of various sizes and a levigator. So graining the lithostone for a new print. Removing the old imagery and resurfacing the lithostone begins with the levigator, water, and carborundum grits ranging from 80 to 220. Graining begins with several applications of coarse grits and ends using a small stone with finer grits. Preparing the stone lithograph for imagery. So the edges of the fully grained stone are filed down to a rounded edge, and gum arabic is applied to the borders. A previously created line drawing is placed on the top of a red iron oxide sheet, and retracing the drawing transfers the imagery to the stone. Image formation. In these 5 illustrations you see grease and water are the key to lithography. Grease, or the drawing materials used to create the image, are grease-based, and then an etch is placed on the top of them that is water-based using gum arabic and some nitric acid, dependent on the materials. What these two substances do is alter the stone's chemistry to a degree so that the gum makes the portions of stone that it touches love water, and the areas that are image-based love grease. So this gum has been wiped down to a very thin layer, and then in illustration 3, the drawing material has been removed with a solvent. It still leaves a bit of the grease subsurface, but has to be replaced with a material called asphaltum, or the equivalent, that will substitute for the drawing material and receive the ink. In the 5th illustration, you see that water has dissolved the gum film and an oil-based ink has been applied with a roller. That is the basis of how lithographs are made. These actions have to be repeated twice in the series to create a stably printed stone. The etch process here is illustrated in frame 1. After a first etch, the drawing is washed away with the solvent, then asphaltum is rubbed on and buffed to a tight layer. In section 2, a watery sponge is used to wash off the gum, which leaves the asphaltum. In image 3, the image on the stone is rolled up with black ink. In image 4, rosin and talc have been applied, and then an etch shown here is distributed around the stone to stabilize the image one further time. In section 5, the scraper bar is placed in the pressure bar up the press and aligned to the stone. And the press pressure is adjusted for the thickness of the stone. Meanwhile, the etch dries on the stone and paper and newsprint are torn down. If it's printed in color, color ink is mixed and the roller is made ready. Steps 1 through 3 are repeated, as I mentioned, always etching twice before you come to the place where you're additioning your stone. Proofing begins slowly with repeated applications of ink and newsprint prints. Inking the stone is always preceded by sponging. In that order, a thin coat of water is applied and sponging and rolling on fresh ink is repeated until the image is fully rolled up. When you're ready to print, you have a fully inked stone and have proofed it several times with newsprint to bring the image up slowly. When a good piece of paper is placed on, you'll always have a newsprint on top of it, and then on top of the newsprint, a tympan, which carries a grease on the top and allows the scraper bar to move frictionlessly across the surface of the stone. You push the stone up to the place where the pressure bar is and lower the handle to engage the press. You crank the stone through and then release the pressure handle and pull it back to the original position. Pull the sheet off and evaluate it, and here you have the process. So through the course of 2 etches, a series of rolling up with various inks, always sponging and then rolling, you have the idea that grease and water resist, and as long as you keep the order water first, grease second, you'll have a consistent amount of prints that you could do when you become experienced. So that's the essence of lithography. And now let's talk a little bit about the history of lithography and a short survey of its applications here. So here's a series of prints from the early 1800s up into the early 1900s from various countries, done by artists and illustrators in the various ways that lithography was created. Here's a series of printing presses. The Sennefelder Gallup press is probably the original form. Each of them have in common that idea of the scraper bar squeegeeing its way across the surface of a tympan, applying even pressure across the width of the image from the front to the back of the image or the top to the bottom. And then you have a couple of other press designs that you find in the 1880 French Brisset press. That's a style of press that was very common in France in the early 1800s through the later 1800s, and the Toulouse-Lautrecs and very famous lithographs that people are familiar with are printed on this type of a press. The German Comet press at the bottom is a mechanized press that other countries made too, but it allowed commercial printing to be done where you had larger sheets, more speed, an automated process where sponging was taken care of inside the mechanism of the press as well as the inking. So it wasn't hand printed in that same sense, but the paper had to be handled by hand means too. There's a tiny press on the bottom left that's an actual portable lithopress where a tiny stone was carried in a briefcase and then there was a crank on the outside that created this screw drive to pull the scraper bar across it, so you could go on a camping trip and make a stone lithograph. The Fuchs and Lang press at the top right is a very common press. I own one myself, and they're a workhorse that have been around for over 100 years, and mine is still functioning. The modern Takich press at the bottom right is the state-of-the-art press today, probably for hand-printed artist lithographers. Here's an illustration of Joseph Lemercier's print workshop in Paris, and notice the two balconies and all the lithostones on the first floor and the men working across the span of this. You see the Bisset type of press in the middle and all these gentlemen and a dog sitting around. So this is the kind of industrialized hand printing that was done back in that day and age. Here's an example of what Sennefelder's dream came to be about printing sheet music, and a lithographic limestone here on the left side from Paris, probably from the middle 1800s. Lithography found its way into editorial cartoons in publications, newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets that were very commonly distributed back in the 1800s. They could be done in color or black and white. They always had a way, as printmaking in general had in its origins a sense of democratization of the form and distribution of knowledge and information. It was in its day like the internet today. Henri Damier. Scientific and biological naturalist illustrations were an early theme for many lithographs. These chromolithographs by Jean-Baptiste Veronnet were created in a portfolio and oftentimes found their ways into various publications, and similar artists work in different subjects, but they had a scientific orientation in their work. There was a lot of posters and ephemera that were pretty much disposable, not collectible items, but found across the globe. This one's printed in Germany, but you can see that it has an Indian theme, and I think this was probably just a small postcard-sized image that might have been distributed for some purposes that I don't understand. One of the more famous lithographers in Paris and France and in the middle to late 1800s was Jules Chernay. His work bridged commercial and artistic boundaries, and they're still tour de forces for, I think, artistic merit. And Chernay was an artist and a publisher, so he made work of his own and did illustrations for various things like circuses and alcohol and bicycles and various things like that. But they're just masterworks, and they're all drawn on stone and separated by hand color, as was the case in those days. Toulouse-Lautrec, another famous artist, worked with other printers to actually produce the work, but he made the stones, artwork on the stones, but the printing probably was done by a professional. So here on the left side you could see Jean Avril Hardin des Prairies, and the four color breakdowns that create the poster as they assemble themselves together. Alphonse Munsha is a Czech artist who was a tour de force artist in making gigantic paintings as well as beautiful lithographs and advertisement for, in this case, bicycles and beer. Here's a series of small lithographs, incredibly complicated chromolithographs that may have as many as 19 or 20 runs on them, showing the four seasons. His design skills were unparalleled in the Art Nouveau period. Chromolithography is a technique that, before the advent of photolitho and four-color separation, was a way to get close to the idea of what a painting looked like. And it may have as many as mentioned, 20 colors in a given print, all applied in layers to mix with one another, and much like a painting would be created, but done through the course of printmaking. And you could see there's a color bar, those little color tabs on the left-hand side of the large illustration. Those are all the colors that were used to create that image. And you could see illustration or registration marks as well, those kind of linear marks on the outside of the print to keep everything in register. Those had to be aligned. There's a color breakdown here in this German lithograph of the two little children, and that shows all the progressive proofs that were made to finally end up with the four-color image there, or the full-color image there. So industrial printmaking, just like today, existed back in the 1800s. All the technology was utilizing stone up to the point where they began to use metal plates, first zinc, then aluminum, which carried forth to today. Aluminum plates are used, stones are no longer used for commercial purposes, only reserved for the use of artists, and a very few at that. So here's a Cincinnati lithography firm, and they probably were one of hundreds of other firms across the United States and in Europe at the time. Some of the more common things was that printmaking allowed the democratization of not just information to flow, but also aesthetic representations of existing paintings or original artwork were done by publishers like Currier and Ives. And all these were multicolor lithographs done on stone. Here's some chromolithographs done for some ephemera like Christmas cards and advertisements. The chromolithographs stand out because the one in the middle, Prang, is a very famous publisher of lithography. And they just have such a polished and a very lucid kind of representation, a very complicated color structure, whereas some of the things that were done for advertising, like the poster on the left, were a little bit cruder but still very charming. You can see a cutout card on the top right and a cigar advertisement wishing you Merry Christmas on the bottom right. Propaganda posters were very famous in the day, and all produced with a lot of panache and graphic design qualities, very painterly, very illustrational, but done in traditional litho. Circus posters, very disposable, but now in a way collectible kind of artifacts from the period. Artistry of the people who made these, both in the control of the print medium and the ability for them all having been hand-drawn, is still unparalleled. The Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin has a collection of circus posters, many of which were done in a tiled fashion so that they could be as big as 10 by 20 feet, and really amazing to see because they're all hand printed on stone and done in a tiled fashion, full color. Europe has always had probably a little bit more appreciation for the arts in general, but printmaking still to this day I think is honored a little bit more. In the Oslo airport, you see a Munch, Edvard Munch lithostone there. As you deboard the plane or you're walking through the lobby, you'll see this print being represented there in the lithostone, the actual stone that Munch drew on. The surface of a lithostone is probably one of the finest surfaces you can draw on, and M.C. Etcher had made amazing amounts of lithographs, and all of which have this masterful quality. You can see two in this example here. But it also has the ability to capture a painterly quality, these Juan Moreau's do very well. So lithography is probably the means today for artists to express their widest range of application, where etchings and letterpress or etchings and woodcuts and engravings have a little bit more limited and obvious appearance. The lithograph can mimic many of the other print forms successfully. The other thing it does is creates a flexible matrix where Picasso here used the idea of a state print in the course of creating, I think, 16 in the total edition, where one print on the top left is then altered after its printing has been done for that given edition. The stone has been altered numerous times and redrawn and deleted and eliminated and added to. So you can see all these bowls came from one lithostone, but in a series of alterations and reprintings. Diego Rivera used color lithography on the left and a black and white lithography on the right. Something very common in today's world. You'll find many Mexican printmakers use marble. He was probably using limestone, but I'm not sure. There's those two stones available that you could actually make lithographs on. Alberto Beltran is another Mexican printmaker. And Jose Clemente Orozco is another. So it's still, printmaking in Mexico still holds high respect and regard, and lithography is done there as well. In America, after the change of technology to aluminum plate lithography, stones fell out of favor. Many printing companies just disposed of them in lakes, rivers, or used them to pave garden paths, or left them in the basements until their companies went out of business. Bolton Brown was a printmaker. He's holding a little lithostone here. He used a little portable press. He would go into the mountains, into the woods. He was a mountaineer and also a naturalist, and he would take his little portable lithopress with him and make his prints. But he brought some awareness back to the artists community in the 1930s here in the United States to kind of revitalize lithography. George Bellows was an artist that he printed the work of, and here's a couple of very political prints. Bellows was kind of a social commentator in his paintings and his prints, and here are two fine examples of that. The WPA Federal Art Project was probably one of the ways that artists revitalized printmaking in the United States. And if you were to go to Stoughton, Wisconsin, there's a gallery called Woodland Gallery that has a fine collection of work from this period, and you could see today and have the ability to buy. But some of the more famous artists from that period that were part of the WPA project are Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood, two Midwestern individuals that had kind of memorialized and heightened awareness in the idea of the common man in the Midwest. Robert Blackburn of the Blackburn Print Workshop in New York City was an artist that probably influenced and trained a whole lot of other people in the arts, worked up into the 1960s. And here's an example of his work. Talia Grossman from her company Universal Limited Art Editions was a collaborator and a printmaker that worked with such people as Robert Rauschenberg, pictured here in this, looking down at some work on the press bed there. Jack Lemon of Landfall Press and Black Rock Editions, not pictured here, was a very famous Chicago and then Santa Fe printmaker and publisher who created work for such artists as Ed Paschke and Christo, as many others as well. Kenneth Tyler was a master printer at Gemini Editions, a California-based printmaking studio that worked with Rauschenberg and various other famous artists. You can see this gigantic stone here being rolled up by Canon, and another Rauschenberg print beside him. This is probably one of the bigger litho stones around. Here's two examples of Robert Rauschenberg prints, and I thought they were interesting because the stone actually broke through the course of this print, and there's many versions of this. Here you can see two. You can see the crack very clearly in the middle of the stone, and that he built that into the idea that the image itself is integrated into that broken stone. Another innovative artist and a compatriot of Rauschenberg's was Jasper Johns, an innovator in lithography and painting. So here's a case where he inked his face and his hands up and rolled himself onto the lithostone and made that the theme of his print. Jim Dine, this is another great example of predominantly an etcher and painter, Jim Dine, but he made some wonderful lithographs. A variety of techniques here used in a 3-color print. These are not small prints. This is actually 2 prints put together. And then June Wayne, the founder of the Tamarind Lithography Institute or workshop. And it started in LA and then moved to New Mexico and became affiliated with University of New Mexico. Here you can see former master printer Bill Lagatuda with some students. And this is the program in the United States today that trains lithographers from all over the world to become professional collaborative printmakers. Here's Robert Cottingham, beautiful example of his that were produced here at Tandem Press in the University of Wisconsin, printed by Andy Rubin, master printer. One of a series of letters of the alphabet that are all generated. Philip Perlstein, 2 examples of his work, simple crayon drawings done with elegance and energy, multicolor lithographs. The one on the right was from the UNO print workshop, that's the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and probably one of the biggest influences in my artistic life as a printmaker. It's my alma mater, and I've been a participating artist in the print workshop there. Norwegian artist, painter, and printmaker Lars Elling makes some very beautiful small painterly lithographs as well as large. Here's a group litho drawn at the UW Parkside in Kenosha, Wisconsin a few years ago during Roberto Torres Mata's residency there, artist residency, and my jurying of the Parkside National Print Show. So I designed this Parkside Bigfoot. We all took part in drawing, and then after the first etch of the stone, this is the finished print on the right. It's one of the things about printmaking today is it's difficult as an individual artist to have your own press, so it exists mostly in educational institutions. So the idea of having a group litho project was a natural fit. Some artists that I have a great deal of admiration for that have been working for the last 40 years or so in the United States and abroad, one of which is Peter Nickel. He makes hand-drawn lithographs, very large. These are probably 40 inches long by 24 inches wide. Robert Nelson has passed away, but he was an artist and educator at various universities, but a visiting artist in Omaha, one of the artists at the UW print workshop that I helped print this print on the left back in the late 1970s. So he was a masterful draftsman and fine imaginative artist. Jack Damer, probably one of the penultimate educators and printmakers in the United States. emeritus professor from the University of Wisconsin and my professor in grad school. Two of his more famous prints, Vermilion Split on the right. Wayne Kimball, who taught at Brigham Young University for some years and makes very tiny, very exquisitely rendered, complicated, hand-drawn and printed lithographs. This probably is 4 by 6 inches. Michael Barnes, professor at the University of Northern Illinois, a scholar of lithography and often visits Europe and other places around the world that focus on traditional stone-based lithography. One of his prints, and one he's drawing at Evil Prints in St. Louis. Elizabeth Jean Younts, a young artist who was a student at the University of Wisconsin, and she has wonderful technique that also pays a lot of homage to past history in printmaking, mixes lithography, stone plate, and screen printing together to create her imagery. Another Wisconsin alumni, Beauvais Lyons, who's a professor at the University of Tennessee, makes lithographs in a very traditional way on stone and plate that kind of poke fun at scientific illustration and imaginative zoology. Erica Walker, another alumni at the University of Wisconsin, and she pays homage to printmaking, most of which done on plate, but very large posters inspired by those propaganda posters from the early 20th century. Andrew Polk is a professor emeritus from University of Arizona and an amazing draftsman and printmaker. He shares his studio with his wife, Catherine Polk, in Indiana right now. Catherine's probably one of the most respected printmakers working today and a visiting artist across the country, making her amazingly ingenious prints. Here's 3 prints by me from various times in the last few years. This print was done with several layers of paper, chincolade, and some other techniques other than lithography instituted. This is a multicolor reduction print done on stone and plate. So thank you for your time, and I hope you look further into the art of lithography.